Hello and welcome, Cultivate community. I'm hoping everyone is funneling in here. We are excited to have everyone here today. As we wait to get everybody to trickle in the room, go ahead and throw into the chat where you are tuning in from today. Kind of curious to see, are you back in an office? Are you still in the home office? Are you sitting on an island somewhere? Where are you today? All right, we're getting some engagement here. As you can maybe see, I am located here in the Cultivate headquarters in Chicago, where it's kind of nice to be back in an office. Not as nice to be having to wear non-stretchy pants and wear nice shoes again, but the rest of it's pretty cool to be able to walk around and have some interaction here. We're going to get started here momentarily as we have an action-packed day ahead of us. So now we got it. Awesome. Well, my name is Simone. I am one of the Cultivate team members here, and I am here to host today's CEO webinar series on the topic diversity and inclusion. I'm going to keep this pretty short and sweet though, because I am not the talented CEO set to speak with you today. So each month when we prepare these webinars, we want to ensure that we give you as the Cultivate community the best we can give you. Most of the time, our topics are in our sweet spot. Accountability that exists around the execution of numbers and our goals. It's all within our propeller system and our methodology. Today's topic is not much different in regards to accountability, but that accountability is around people today. And as we focus in on diversity and inclusion in our small businesses. And so because of this, I wanted to bring to you guys some of the best that I can deliver in order to make sure that we bring the highest to our community in terms of help. So it is my privilege to introduce Xavier, which I'm going to do shortly, who we've met through the Cultivate community, and one of our advisors, Eric Fenton, works with actively. And so before we started this webinar, I had the ability to do some research, watch some videos, and get myself comfortable with Xavier as a speaker. And I have to say, I was able to watch a same video. It's about a 23-minute video. I watched it 3 or 4 times. And each time I watched it, I picked up different things around just the messaging or just the accountability of myself as a leader when thinking about how I position myself within Cultivate. And that made me really think, oh my goodness, I still have a ton of growth and a ton of blind spots for myself personally that I have to improve on to my teammates and my community members. And so my hope is that when you just watch and observe for 40 minutes here, you have the same ability as me to be able to go back in this recording, rewatch, and continue to grow yourself, because his impact of his words, his intentionality, and the actionability that he's able to deliver in such a short amount of time is unbelievable. So I'm extremely excited for you guys to experience and watch somebody who's really dynamic as well as impactful in a topic that is so important in today's community as well as in small businesses today. So with no further ado, and to make sure that I get the right leader in the room here, I want to introduce to you Xavier Ramey, who is extremely talented as well as one of the leading individuals in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he's the CEO of Justice Inform, a social impact and consulting firm that has advised some of the biggest companies in the world. And we have the privilege to speak to here today in our Cultivate community. So please help give a warm welcome to native Chicagoan Xavier Ramey for today's CEO webinar.
Thanks so much, Simone. And I see all the little hands going up. That's great. Thank you all so much in the Cultivate community for bringing me in. To those of you who are listening, thank you for making space and time for an important and urgent conversation. I'm hoping that you leave this space and this time with a better understanding, not of what the work is and the terms and all these sorts of things, but I hope that you leave it with what Simone referenced, which is an understanding of your role to play. A bit of background about myself and Justice Inform before I jump into this. I am a native Chicagoan. I am currently out in the woods of Tennessee in the Smoky Mountains. I needed to get a week away and just really rest and recharge. 2020 was a very challenging year for any person like myself who works in the equity space, particularly with so many institutions looking to start a journey that is centuries old. And so I'm here in Tennessee, but in many ways, my heart is still in Chicago. I grew up in the North Lawndale neighborhood. If you've ever read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, which is a seminal piece he authored several years ago about the importance of not just racial reconciliation, because I think that's a unuseful way of thinking about racial equity. Reconciliation can only happen when there's a functional relationship. There has never been a functional relationship among major racial groups in American history. Not systemically, there have been individual relationships, but not systemic. And he wrote that about my neighborhood and about the actions, the generational actions of everything from misinterpretation of people's cultural identities over to actual land theft, over to how business plays such a critical role in ensuring inequity as a sustainable practice for our nation. It's through that lens, through the lens of North Lawndale, that I stepped into the business world. My formal background is actually in economics, and I started as a commodities trader at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I started right before the Great Recession, and if y'all know, the Great Recession was not a great time to be in financial services. But it taught me quite a bit. And it also, that experience gave me my first instance of understanding so early in my career why DEI, why diversity, equity, inclusion is so important. I remember my first day at the trading firm that I started out just as an intern and then moved my way up to becoming a trader. And a white woman walked up to me and she said, "It's so great to see you here. We just doubled our percentage of minority employees." And I looked at her and I was like, "What do you mean doubled?" Because in my eyes, what I saw was a white person. What she saw was herself as a woman. And in that, I realized the distinction, not just between the two of us, but the prevailing norms of the culture in which we both operated. And though she was operating very successfully, incredibly financially successful, bringing in millions of dollars for the firm every year, she still had that identity marker that caused her to be able to see from the moment I stepped in that I was different, but also to be able to see where our points of identity alignment would potentially create an opportunity for friendship. And she eventually became one of my most important mentors there because she knew what I was stepping into and she knew what I was facing. I did not receive that level of mentorship or support from any of the male colleagues that were there. All of them were white. And that's an experience in the early career that I think many people, as they go on, as they grow and they get older, they forget that that's sometimes how people start. And so when you're thinking about recruiting and all these things, there's these little things that happen in the day-to-day that aren't part of the big DEI strategy that eventually become the lens through which people see their entire lives. That small experience was a big experience. It was an epiphany moment for me. Where I realized that all that I'd been trained in, all that I was skilled in, all that I'd learned, being in the top of my class in accounting, going into Future Business Leaders of America, being the vice president of the economics club, all of these types of things, they wouldn't stop how I would experience the world of work. They wouldn't add as much value as I thought they would add either. Over the years, I was really blessed to be able to have some incredible roles. I left financial services. I thought it was a very, very challenging place to work as a young African-American man. But I also just didn't like the fact that I didn't like what we were doing. I didn't like that we were just buying and selling without any real lens on global impact and social growth. That much of what we were doing at best, was agnostic to human life. And at worst, fundamentally antithetical to the sustainability of wealth equity and social equity and all of these types of things that had created the North Lawndale experience of growing up in the hood that I had. And when I went into the workplace, meeting all these new people, realizing that they had literally architectured an entire lifestyle where they had no probability of knowing about my experiences from the very zip codes that we had. I would have to be their teacher, and their teacher as they thrashed into learning about things that they may resist even learning. And I didn't want to be their teacher. I left financial services, and I haven't looked back, though I understand, many sectors are growing and changing. I eventually went back into the social sector, and I got a job in North Lawndale at a nonprofit, leading their fundraising work and then leading also their marketing work. And there I learned about the psychology of goodness. Eventually is what I called it, the doctrine of goodness in many ways that many Americans, I think, operate under. And given the ways in which wealth inequality works, most of the people that I was going out to raise money from were white. And they definitely did not live anywhere near where we were serving and where we were doing our work to build up a divested community. And in going out and talking and having casual conversations, I was learning just the immense gap in knowledge, the immense gap in experience, but also how people want to learn, how people actually want to learn about these things, to learn these things in the safeness, the safety of comfortable conversations, rather than the power of accountable discussions. They preferred to learn as an exercise in solidarity rather than learn as an opportunity to grow their capacity to be impactful as neighbors. And it was really, really instructive for me to see that sometimes it's not even about the information you're providing. It's about the fact that the information you're talking about as it relates to equity, whether it be racial or gender or otherwise, is often coming into complete conflict with how people see and want to build their lives. In order for the charity that I was out there asking for to not be an issue, in order for us to have what we needed in North Lawndale, we would have to have a global economic model that saw the value of what is in the minds of the people of North Lawndale, rather than seeing them as charitable opportunities, seeing them as actual investable opportunities, seeing them as the employees of the future, and seeing not just that the neighborhood is really rough and these sorts of things, but seeing that it's not rough for no reason. Things don't just happen. You don't just lose 40% of your housing stock overnight. That doesn't happen without a interconnected web of business mechanics and people and commissions and these sorts of things allowing for this to happen. And at the crux of what I was learning as I was moving through my life was that people didn't really have a strong understanding that they were connected to me. At the core of DEI work is the assumption that we are all connected. Now, many people may not want to be connected, but as Dr. King said, it is the inescapable network of mutuality that binds us all. The inescapable network of mutuality. Whether you want to or not, we're connected. We're connected. We're all connected. And particularly as the world globalizes at such an advancing pace, we cannot operate under the assumption that one of us does not affect the rest of us. And we must see the responsibilities inherent in such an epiphany. I eventually left that and went to become the head of an impact investing fund, and was primarily focused just on workforce development, getting people jobs, finding opportunities to bring people from places like Lawndale and Auburn Gresham and communities around the counties into living wage opportunities at big companies like UPS and Aon and others, and seeing where can we create these blocks of jobs. But in that, you start to see the breakdown. You see how HR gets in the way. You see how the general counsel becomes the biggest block to equity in many situations because they're just looking through the lens of legal compliance when the law is often a lagging indicator for equity. People make laws after enough people get hurt. So why would we look to the law to define our integrity about what is truly equitable? Not to say that there's no need for law, that there's no need for order, but just to say that we should understand how it creates progress, that it often comes after pain, not before it. And so in talking about DEI with lawyers, it's often very difficult. There's sometimes we're the most at odds because I'm talking about a world that the law does not yet imagine. And I'm talking about it through the lens of abundance rather than scarcity and compliance. I'm talking about it through the opportunities that come from proximity rather than segregation, but proximity requires a comfort with integration rather than an experience with exclusivity. All of these different workplace experiences formed my lens on how business, operations, legality, sociology, public policy, and humans come together. when I finally landed at my last role at the University of Chicago, leading their social innovation and philanthropy work, I realized that this chaos, as I call it, is total. Inheriting the space of young people, young minds, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, to teach social justice and equity theory through the lens of business mechanics, government, public policy, and social development in communities of need, I realized that many of their parents were teaching them actively not to understand these things. The books that they came in having read gave them no level of emotional preparation for a psychological response they were having to an intellectual conversation about government, or an intellectual conversation about business, or an intellectual conversation about people. They did not even have the psychological grounding to deal with the emotions that were rising up as they even thought about a thing, equity, that they had not even yet chosen. That is something to think about. Our world practices not knowing. If you study the work of bias, you understand that expediency bias is a very powerful thing. It's the brain's way of quickly creating these buckets of information so that you don't have to keep relearning things. It's like walking. You don't think 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 4 step. You walk so that you can move quickly and expediently through the world, so that you can focus on other things that now require your attention. This happens also with relationships. People are constantly moving too quickly. I started Justice Informed in 2017. I started it after the Trump election. I started it after I saw the casual xenophobia that was being offered, as I felt, throughout our country. But I started it not just because of what I was seeing in terms of what I did not agree with. But I also started Justice Informed because I saw that there's an opportunity for a moment to create a stronger definition, for a stronger pace, and a more urgent vision to something that has always been asked of the world of business and government in America. A sustainable relationship among people who are different. That's what DEI is about. It's about creating the operational infrastructure for sustainable relationships for people who are different, specifically because they engage in places where they cannot avoid each other, i.e. the workplace. You see, there are many people who call out for diversity, equity, inclusion, and they say, we need more DEI, we need a focus, we value it, we value it, we value it, we value it. They demand it of their company, and I've seen this happen hundreds and hundreds of times. They demand it of their company. And then they go home and segregate the city they live in. They actively choose racially homogenous communities. They actively choose communities with obvious class divides. They actively choose segregation as if that does not reinforce the lack of probability for their learning about what is happening to other people, that they then go back to work to say, I care. This cannot be solved. You cannot solve inequality, which is different from equity. You cannot solve inequality with segregation, whether that be a personally mandated segregation or a governmentally enforced segregation. You cannot solve inequity by moving away from one another. And here's the rub. Many people think, and I'll just say that this is an opinion of mine, but I will hold it as an informed opinion based on engaging in building DEI strategies now for dozens of nonprofits, corporations, small community collectives. And this is informed by years and years and years of having challenging conversations with people who actively do not agree with me. One of the most seminal experiences I ever had was going head to head and just talking with an Airbnb host when I was out in South Dakota, who was trying to explain to me why he and his buddies in the Aryan Nation weren't so bad after all. Now, you may ask, how did I end up in a situation where I'm having a casual conversation about someone who actively identifies with the KKK and with the Aryan Nation, and how as a Black person did I see myself as being safe in that space? And that's for another conversation about the tactics of courage and conversation. But at the core of it was that he had never met anyone like me. Last night, when I was in Gatlinburg, I went to a bar, and the bartender, he said, "I bet you're a liberal." I said, "Well, how do you know?" And he's like, "Because you got a mask on." I was like, "Because I got a mask on." I mean, yeah, I got a mask on. I mean, everyone's around me. He's like, I knew it. I knew it. And I was like, "Well, I'm from Illinois." He's like, "You're from Illinois. I can tell." What ensued was this long conversation about our differences. But stepping into that conversation is a choice for me. And here's what a lot of people mistake, and I'm going to get back to the point I was trying to make. People are actively avoiding learning. They are doubling down on exclusion. And in order to powerfully engage DEI, and I'm going to assume that everyone who's listening right now actually wants to positively engage the work of diversity, equity, inclusion. In order to positively engage it, it must be a personal practice before it becomes a professional responsibility. In order for me to know how to engage, for instance, some of the people that we meet when we're working with companies in California, or we're working with folks down in Florida, or we're working with groups up in Toronto or otherwise, in order for me to know how to engage that, it can't be new for me. We're talking about people in Southern Illinois, solidly politically different from myself. I have to know how to engage that, and I can't learn that on the job. I've got to know that before I jump in, which brings us to where we are in the current day. A very, very dangerous place for most leaders. One of the most dangerous places you can be as a leader is in the position of leadership, while understanding your lack of capacity to deliver results towards this issue and to be visible, meaning you can't hide. Everyone sees you. You're in the seat. But you know you don't have it. You know you don't know. You know you don't understand, and you're afraid of making another statement. You're looking at it and you're saying, "My gosh, I mean, Israel, Palestine, should we, is this our job? I don't understand. Black Lives Matter, but is it to defund the police people? Like, what is that?" And you just spent the last 5 years actively promoting a DEI strategy that specifically focused primarily on diversity, which is just about hiring and recruiting and potentially even in retention. And now you have, let's say, 15, 20% more people of color in your firm. And they're looking up to say, "Well, when we're here, we expect that you're comfortable with these conversations." But in your mind, it's just been a numbers game. It's just been about hiring. This is what I'm seeing right now. This is where a lot of leaders are at, especially a lot of white male leaders. They are right there. They see it. They see it. They see what's happening. They see where it's going. On the other side of them, you have a lot of white women leaders who see what's happening. They see that for some reason, and we see this across the DEI space, the majority of first hires for people who are just starting their DEI journey at their company, usually their first hire is for an HR lead or a vice president of HR. Usually it is a white woman. And a person who may be gender aware but racially fragile is now equipped to lead for things that perhaps even she's shaky on. Or you hire a person who's African American, assuming that that'll solve everything, but they may be racially aware, but they're also ability unaware, meaning they don't understand the world of disability rights. They may still just be thinking through compliance and the Americans with Disabilities Act, like the general counsel might. You see what I'm saying? This is why I love these articles. There was an article that came out last year talking about how hard it is to hire for a chief diversity officer role. And it's because it is unlike any other role in a business. It is part operational maestro and genius. You have to understand corporate operations. You have to understand budgeting and compliance. You have to understand therapy and human communications at a level that most other executives, for instance, like I talk with a lot of CFOs, and this is just, it's such a foreign concept sometimes. It's outside of the practice. You have to be aware of things that have happened throughout time that create the conflicts that we're now presented with. It is a very different role. So the first thing I want to impress upon you all is understanding that this role is very different. The next thing that I want to impress upon you is that there's a process that I think is helpful in thinking about the ways to engage this. One is that, at the core of why we're here is because there's been a systemic lack of acknowledgement. about the ways in which people of various identities, particularly those who are privileged, and naming those in America, that means you're talking about people who identify predominantly as Christian, people who identify as male, people who identify as heterosexual, people who identify as white. These types of folks, for the most part, there has been a near wholesale lack of acknowledgement that matters for people who do not hold those identities for various reasons, whether it be time bias, meaning that I wasn't there, it wasn't me, and I don't agree that the past affects the future, even though if you read any financial prospectus, it will say that the past cannot predict future results. However, you all know about the law of the compounded interest, so you know that investing today does create a opportunity later on. Like, these things are real. The past affects us today, but people don't acknowledge that it either existed. When we look at things like anti-Semitism, that harm didn't even happen in some people's minds. And it creates this anti-Semitic approach to people and their histories and experiences, or to the effects and the vestiges of slavery, despite the immense documentation in books like My Grandmother's Hands that talks about the realities of inherited trauma. Despite all of this scholarship and all of this information, people still say, I do not recognize the conflict. And being more than conversant in diversity, equity, inclusion requires that you understand the difference between whether you're trying to mediate a conflict and manage a conflict, or whether you're still stuck at conflict identification. Everyone doesn't even identify the conflict the same. And so the next step of building a DEI strategy, which is usually repair, can't even be done because we've not come to terms on the level, the direction, or the severity of pain, of harm, of being left out, of the value of exclusion. When I said earlier that exclusion and segregation are sustainable practices, I remember several years ago being on a panel with a vice president of a bank, and the woman was one of the actually executive vice presidents of this multinational bank. And I was just saying something to me, very factful. There is no company that is on the Fortune 500 list right now in America that was created before the last 15 years that was not built on the platforms of white supremacy. To me, that's not an emotional statement. And I'm saying that as someone who studies sociology, who understands public policy, actively engages in the scholarship, and I've removed my emotional, in many ways, responses to things that I'm like, but this is just true. There's active exclusion happening for generations. That is supremacy. The norms of the culture within that organization all require that you conform to things that come out of a Euro-colonial model. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. Look at Euro-colonial models, study them, and here you go. And the bristling that she had at that, the bristling as a woman of color, because of what it also said about her investments in her employer. This is where we're at. But the repair wasn't possible because she, as the leader of this work, did not see the harm the same and did not see the firm's participation in it the same, even though I had already done enough work to understand how community reinvestment acts work and how that had turned into their philanthropy model. And as someone who used to work with CRA officers, I understand how that type of money goes out in terms of mortgages to low to moderate income households. I already know the limitations of that work and how it is not fundamentally anti-racist. But that was a heart conversation that she couldn't have with herself. And so then moving over to the real powerful work of accountability, which requires the reorganizing of normative values, we could not even do. We did not identify the conflict the same, so we could not manage the conflict. Because we could not manage the conflict, we could repair no harm done by the conflict. Because we could do no repair of the conflict, because we had different interpretations of what the conflict was, we could not rebuild a better structure to ensure the improbability of that harm happening again. That's DEI work. That's DEI work. Moving towards accountability requires you to understand that importance of acknowledgement, the importance of repair, and the importance of changing norms. Because, and I'm just saying this using I statements, as a Black man who was born in America in Chicago in a place that the Chicago Tribune once called the home of the permanent underclass. That's what the Tribune called my neighborhood. I am simply saying that other people's definitions of acknowledgement have not sufficed for a person like me. And I also can see very clearly, being someone who works on the front lines of the equity movement within corporate America, exactly why this is not moving quickly. When we look at the $4.8 billion that tech spent since last year, when George Floyd was killed, there was $4.8 billion worth of commitments made by tech companies throughout the United States. And when we look at the data today, year over year, we don't see much change, but we also don't see an actual alignment to the level of language that was being used last year about what they were being accountable for and to. This is what I'm saying. There are standards to this work. There are standards to this work, and the standards are far beyond the point of good intentions. The deployment of these standards requires a level of expertise that many firms have not either understood or made resources available to engage. Just 3 weeks ago, I had to politely decline a major university in the southern states who had asked us to come in and lead a diversity, equity, inclusion audit of several departments, lead executive trainings for some of their senior team members, and to create a licensable course for their general rank and file adjunct faculty around the conversation of institutional DEI and how that relates to curriculum development for students. Their entire budget was $10,000. It's impossible. So long as I require paying a minimum living wage to my staff, it's impossible to be able to move with those types of budgets. Impossible. Did they have good intentions? Yes. Did I try to give as much free advice as I could to, the guy on the other side? He's a director at the organization, and he was just like, I'm just exasperated. It's like, I've been looking for folks, but we fought so hard just to get $10,000. I know. And people want to work with majority Black and brown firms and women-led firms that are doing DEI work. And our firms have been institutionally and systemically disinvested in for generations. My father led a DEI firm in many ways, a social impact and consulting firm called Sustainable Communities and Associates. He died when I was 18. We lived off of $20 a week for a house of 6, just for food. The work I do today was unsustainable in 1995. Not because the value of equity was not there, but because the belief in the importance of equity by those people who did not hold my father's identity was not there. Now, how long ago was 95? Who on here was alive in 95? I was. That was a long time ago argument keeps happening. This is the thing. This goes back to the question of, do you see this work as systemic, or do you see this work as individual? Do you see your stepping into this work as taking your place in a wide group of people who are saying the buck starts towards equity with me, and the buck for inequity stops with me? I cannot do work that I believe in if I do not understand how to do it. The value of my intentions can never set the pace for the work. Ambition and skill are not the same thing. So what matters now? Because everything that I just said was not a pretty picture. What matters now? I think right now what really matters in the DEI conversation is people being willing to sort of open up their books. People being willing to conduct DEI assessments, conduct DEI audits. There's a saying that I often say back to my team, right? We have to know that our work often is opening up wounds, and we don't open wounds we can't close. When you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, you are creating expectation among many people, not who like DEI, who need DEI. You're creating expectation, and that expectation should not be avoided. However, it may be opening up wounds of expectation, wounds of experience. And just like if you go to the doctor, you would expect that a person who opens you up should know how to close you too. You would also expect that you can't go in and tell a doctor what to do. Cut me open, doc. I got a cold. Surgery comes after a diagnosis. And so one of the main things to think about right now is understanding the value and the role of expertise. All the time I get people who tell me, hey, this is what we need, this is what we need, this is what we need. And I immediately slow them down in that business development conversation. I immediately slow them down in that discussion about their organizational nuances and such. And I'm immediately just saying, hey, tell me a little bit about where it hurts. Stop telling me about what you want. Don't just tell me about what you're hoping for, because what you're hoping for probably comes out of something that you don't have. So I need to know where that gap is in your organization before I start sending our team in. We can't just show up and do trainings. We have to know who you are. One of the organizations that we've been working with and are increasing our engagement with, last year they passed on an opportunity with us because they felt that our definition around anti-racism and such was very, very rigorous, and they felt that that was good. But the approach and the way, the size of our organization and things, just was not something that they felt was aligned with what they needed and wanted. A bad experience is in many ways worse than no experience. And they brought in a consultant who offered what later one person, their team said was a watered down understanding of DEI. And when they looked at the exit surveys, that person told me that many of the white leaders felt it was a powerful experience. And the few Black leaders that they had and brown leaders that they had, and including some of the women leaders that they had, were all actually angrier at the end of it because it wasn't actually even about them. DEI is supposed to be about people who hold marginalized and minoritized identities, but it wasn't even about them. It was actually about teaching the people who were not those types of identity holders, while having people of color and women sit in the room and watch people have epiphanies about something that they could have learned somewhere else, which then leads to attrition, leads to workplace dissatisfaction, leads to tarnished reputations, creates financial hazards, increased costs in recruiting, and all of those downstream things, which I'm sure you all can imagine. But when someone comes in and says, we need to do a training, that's exactly why I say, yeah, but what type? And for whom? This is why we require assessment prior to training. But I know there are a lot of DEI firms out there that will just come in with a, here's what diversity is, training. Would you ever go to a doctor that didn't even want to have a diagnosis before they opened you up? That points to one of the core challenges in the DEI sector right now. There are so many different approaches to this work. I can see it is overwhelming for anyone who's on the other side trying to find a firm like Justice Informed to even know how to evaluate competencies, to even know what types of questions to ask. And this is why starting this conversation around assessment is so important. Understanding the value of coaching rather than just training, of bringing people along in different ways. This is why caucusing is important. If that's not a term you're familiar with, caucusing essentially means you're taking people of one identity group to work together for their problem. Women know about the gender pay gap. This morning, I was reading Cranes and I saw a woman who I'm on the board of directors with for an organization, and she's one of the most highly touted CEOs in Chicagoland, has 3x'd her organization in about 6 years, doubled the staff from a couple dozen to hundreds. She's moving to a new job as a CEO of another organization, this time an organization that's struggling, and she's there to ramp it up. But she's been focusing on supporting women through this organization she's been working on. And this one is more gender agnostic, more so even focused on men. And I looked and I saw the pay rate for the man who just left the job and has been out of that role for a year, who's departing this now struggling organization, and the woman I'm on the board of directors with. The difference in pay was nearly $400,000. I could not believe it. And this was printed in Cranes. Women understand the pay equity gap. They don't need to be in the room with the men to learn that. And oftentimes it can be a burden for them to do so. Because not only is it an exercise in futile learning, because they often know these things, but the other side is they are, again, reawakening to the fact that people who are in higher levels of position have lower levels of competency about something and continue to be promoted. And that is re-traumatizing. That's why caucusing is so important. But how do you know to do that unless you actually allow for someone to come in and provide a diagnosis to go into your books? Here are a couple challenges with doing that work, and I want to give two case examples. We try to go into people's books. We try to conduct these assessments and audits, and increasingly there are fewer and fewer DEI firms that are willing to do that type of work. And I will acknowledge, because it requires a level of organizational expertise that is very hard to find in the marketplace, but also because it means that you'll end up oftentimes fighting with people inside your client firms. For example, one organization we worked with last year was a financial services firm. And I've historically thought that we would never work with very many financial services firms, partly because just the psychology, I find, the psychography of many of the leaders that I meet in the financial services sector. There's a pride and a I can't be taught anything thing that I often find. So it's not that I don't think that we'll work with them. I just don't think it's probable. And we did have one that came and asked to come in and say, Xavier, we want Justice Informed to build the roadmap, build the whole model. And I was so excited, hesitant, but excited. Brought the team in, and we conducted a DEI assessment of their organization, launched a company-wide, their first ever DEI engagement survey to understand their ambitions, the ambitions that people had for DEI, the experiences they'd had with inclusivity or equity or diversity, their levels of competency, self-assessing their own individual levels of competency, and acknowledging how their ability to understand this may be impacting their role as departmental leaders or individual leaders or rank and file staff or otherwise. And I remember when we were just even trying to get the survey out, one of the hardest moments was actually in a conversation that led to multiple meetings, which finally led to a bit of a clash between myself, the vice president, and the general counsel. And it was because of many of the questions, they had questions about our questions that we were asking their team, because these questions would create ideas and questions that they themselves did not necessarily know how to manage. But one of them that always stood with me was when we had asked for their employees to voluntarily name any cultural norms they were aware of operating within that firm. That is a standard survey question for a DEI report. Please name any of the dominant cultural norms that you see operating as a cultural normative value within your firm. And we give examples. For instance, whiteness can be a cultural norm. Heteronormativity can be a dominant cultural norm. Christian identity can be a dominant cultural norm. We've seen this in organizations that seek to hire people of religious difference. They bring in people who are Muslim, and they don't realize that the whole drinking culture for business development doesn't always work when you're looking at religious diversity. And they didn't even realize they were operating under this very much Christian accessible, alcohol accessible cultural norm, because everybody here does that. And that's what we did in college, and we met, and now we're business partners, and it's not oppressive, these sorts of things. And we asked them to just name them. And the fights that we ended up with the general counsel, because as they said, if our employees name our culture and name specific identities, white, heterosexual, Christian, those are all protected categories under the Civil Rights Act of '64. If they name those things, it can create a legal precedent. Should we one day find ourselves being alleged of having been racist or sexist or homophobic or otherwise, and we don't want to create that type of a legal precedent. And I remember looking at the GC, and I remember looking at the vice president and just saying, I'm sorry, injustice doesn't give you better options, but you're going to have to decide whether your integrity is stronger than the law right now. In the same way that companies, before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, had to decide whether they believed that Black lives truly mattered and insist on not discriminating on the basis of race whether they believed that women were valuable contributors and innovators in the workplace before they were a protected, marginalized identity under the law. They had to have that integrity conversation before the law caught up. And this was what our clients were being presented with. This is a very typical DEI conversation. We were engaged by another company, or it was actually a larger nonprofit of several dozen large philanthropic and corporate and social impact leaders. They made public statements about their valuing of anti-racism. We believe in the value of anti-racism. We believe that racial equity is paramount to DEI. We believe that we must reflect these values. They made these shortly after, or actually a little bit before George Floyd was killed. So we said, okay, let's do the assessment. Let's see what you believe and whether that belief can turn to action, not because it can't, but it may not be possible with the people you have here. And that's always my lens on it. It's not that I'm saying you can't do types of work, but I'm just curious about whether you can do it with the folks you have, whether their level of will is sufficient to create accountability that matters to people who need it. A couple of the data points that came out of that, 94% of their executive leaders reported that issuing a public statement about their values against racism was important and necessary, 94%. Later on, we asked whether they were willing to back that up with actions. 31% said that the organization's focus on racism should be included on their partnership and business collateral. So that 94% that said we need this to be publicly stated, we need it on our website, we need people to know what we stand for, 94% of the executives that were assembled said yes. When asked if that should be printed, 31% said yes. When we looked at racial equity as an evaluative tool, because many people say, hey, it's about supplier diversity. It's about diversifying who you're dealing with and sometimes who you're not dealing with. When we asked whether using a racial equity lens was paramount in how they evaluated the importance and shape of any business or partnership opportunity moving forward, 75% of their executives said absolutely. Looking at racial equity as a lens is paramount in how we evaluate any new opportunities we have. We later asked, should that lens mean that they do not partner with organizations or companies or individuals that don't align with their racial equity values? 25% of the executives said, though we did say we should be evaluating people on the basis of whether they align with our values on racial equity, that does not mean we should cease working with them. Essentially, they were saying we shouldn't use our capacity or resources to throw our weight around to push racial equity forward for people who may not have our capacity or weight to throw around. You see how this is dropping once we ask for action? Anti-racism, one of the core tenets of anti-racism is demilitarization. Understanding that Black and brown lives are often put in compromising or lethal positions because of how people understand the very body itself of Black and brown people. And one of the most important parts of anti-racism, and this actually comes from Kingian nonviolence studies. If you study Kingian nonviolence from the King Institute, you'll find it's white supremacy, hypercapitalism, and demilitarization that form the basis for anti-racism. And so we simply asked, hey, on the basis of this, knowing that police reform is a constant conversation around racial equity, and you all have said you wanted racial equity, which means you have to have some level of position on policing and the military. And we asked, though police reform is a key part of the global push for racial equity, would you all be interested in no longer partnering or working with military or police organizations, regardless of whether reform occurs or not? 37.5% of the executives said we would agree with that. This is why I insist on not just going into organizations that ask for trainings and just delivering trainings. This is why when people say we believe in something, I say, let's prove it. This is why I'm encouraging all of you not to let this work move at the pace of your intentions, because your intentions may not always understand the type of action that is required to actually create equity. And I want to be clear, and I'm going to end this on this point, the difference between equity and equality is real. Equality is assuming that we're all starting at the same point. Equality assumes that we can, if we both had a stick, we could both swing it. That's simply not the way life works. I didn't have to fight my way out of the hood only to show up to a conversation where people were saying, well, we just need to start on equal ground. I'm like, there was no equality from the beginning. What I had to endure, the types of spaces I've had to engage, the types of experiences I don't get to run away from, whether they are, ones that I choose to, or whether they're my Airbnb host. I don't get to just run away from those conversations. Of course, those things affect me. They actually create a stronger constitution for my professional acumen. Now, everyone doesn't have to engage that level of severity of learning that I take on, but it is something that I do believe makes you stronger. But what I'm saying is that we don't have equality right now. We never have. We don't have equity right now. We never have. Equity is about looking at that process I gave before: acknowledgement, repair, and reorganization of norms. That's what equity allows for. Equality means that you're asking people to forget their last experiences and assuming that the work of compounded privilege, not just compounded interest, doesn't produce a greater value over time. That's what that assumes. And that's simply not possible. We're fighting for equity. But equity has to be evaluated on the basis of the people who truly need it, not the people who are just learning that it's different from equality. Social progress must move at the pace of the level of need for safety of people who hold marginalized and minoritized identities, not at the speed of comfort of people who do not. And so I invite you all into that work. Know that when you work with DEI consultants and consult, whether they're firms like my own or whether they are individual operators like I used to be before we became a firm, we all have different paces. Some of us will just simply say, no, thank you. I don't think that the important work that we're doing will be possible with that pace. Or I don't believe that the work we will be doing under these constraints and fears would be valuable to people who hold identities like my own. And so we choose not to work. And you'll find other folks who say, doesn't matter what you got, I can help. Come on in. There's a wide diversity of people in this field right now. There are a lot of people who are looking for jobs right now in DEI. I was just speaking out against some of the certificate programs that I've seen. 12-hour classes to become an expert in all I just talked about. 12-hour classes to get a certificate that you then put on LinkedIn. And someone in HR and some company down the street sees that you got a diversity certificate, and they assume that you know how to deal with their general counsel. They assume that you know how to talk through organizational mechanics. They assume that you understand the difference between equity and equality and how that shows up on the balance sheet and how that then shows up in someone's individual income. There's a lot of work to be done. And I think that our sector is at the beginning of fleshing itself out. Think about DEI, institutional DEI, how we might have thought about the internet in 1995. It's the dawn of creating structure for an era that will usher in a new type and formation for human relationships throughout this nation and the world for the time to come. That's where we're at right now with DEI. We're at the starting line. So I invite you all to join me there. All right. I'm going to bring Eric back in. We're going to take some questions. I'm very excited to have any questions, take any questions you all have. Feel free, no holds barred, don't hold back. I mean, I'll take whatever types you have. But I want to thank you all at Cultivate. And thank you also, Eric, for being my Cultivate advisor. It's been great working with you.
Well, thanks, X, for saying that. And that very much goes both ways. One of the questions came from Rebecca, and she was highly participatory, had a lot of great stuff here. So thanks, Rebecca. But just for, hearing that $10,000 number in the budget, right, and that just being insufficient, like I get that was in the context of a much larger institution. But as you're thinking about where a lot of the folks are here, as we're listening to you, I guess, what are your thoughts around, what does a small business put aside in terms of thinking about how we can get that kind of training and access it, whether through you or other strong kinds of DEI consulting firms out there?
Well, it really depends. So I'll kind of give you a lens into the landscape of DEI practitioners. So there are single owner operators. Mm-hmm. And it's sometimes a little difficult to suss out whether a single owner operator has a firm or whether they are flying solo and have like a project assistant or an executive assistant to help with calendaring, scheduling, all that kind of stuff. That will affect the type of and size of deal they can take on. And so that's the first thing, and that has nothing to do with what your organization needs. Firms will often have more people to do this work, right? We have, DEI strategists at one level and DEI strategists at another level. We've got analysts who help with research and the survey methodology, these sorts of things. Single owner operators don't usually have those types of resources. Their projects usually take a little bit longer as well because of that. When we were just myself, a DEI assessment used to take 9 months. Now we can complete them in 4 to 5. Saving time on the client side, but also in many ways, because there's a larger group of team that's working with it, our deal size often also requires them to be larger. Many times organizations want to ensure that there is a probability of diversity of thought in their consulting team. And so they'll be saying, okay, can a person who identifies as a Black cisgender heterosexual like Xavier truly advise on issues of the LGBTQIA community within our organization when we're talking about setting up an affinity group or setting up, this type of an engagement or otherwise? Or can Xavier, who identifies as able-bodied, truly speak to what are the needs for people who have either visible or invisible disabilities? All of these types of things are part of the conversation. So one of the things that I would say is, if you're looking at just in general cost, think about your annual training budget as part of your professional budget for DEI. What I often say, for instance, just transparently, our trainings, it's $175 per person, $175 per person. We look at 25 person minimums. Thereafter, it's just a la carte. We license our material out for a significantly reduced rate. We just require that we have a train the trainer opportunity with someone inside so that we can ensure that our work is being engaged to a level of excellence that we would expect given our reputation and given our corporate standards. When you're thinking about assessments and audits, think about the difference between whether you're assessing for culture or whether you're assessing for practices and policies. Culture is about the experience people are having with one another. Practices and policies are about your books. The difference there for a consulting firm is vast. For me to assess culture, that is all qualitative and quantitative data that is received by speaking to or with people. An audit, just like an accountant, requires that we're looking at your financial statements. We're understanding how you make your money and whether that aligns with equity work. We're looking at your HR strategies. We're looking at your last couple of years of hires and fires. We're going into the books. That can take significantly longer, but it also provides you with the ability to have a significantly more robust DEI strategy should you want to move it forward. In general, I would say that assessments, depending on the size of firm, you may find some firms that'll do an assessment for, maybe even 15, 20, 25K. On the other side, you'll find organizations that would say, hey, an audit would be significantly larger. We may do it for 50. For a firm like Justice Informed, we would be looking at assessments usually starting somewhere around like 50 to 75, with the roadmap being additional, and audits are significantly more. So it just depends on the type of firm and these sorts of things. And I want to acknowledge that does make it difficult for smaller firms. I would also say for smaller firms to think about DEI not as an initiative, but to think about it through the imperative of innovation that it allows for. In the same way that you would create a marketing budget and you wouldn't say, well, what can we get for $5,000? And for that to be catalytically changing every single employee's experience, don't do that with DEI.
It's good. Thank you. That helps.
And just to wrap here, we probably have time for one more question for about like a 1 minute answer. And it looks like Nicole asked a pretty good one. Eric, if you want to read that one.
Let me go to that one. Yeah, what would be the one action, X, that you would enlist each of us to take today to move from intentions to action?
There's a couple simple ones. One is within your organization, if you already have DEI committees and these sorts of things, we always recommend the 5% rule, meaning that anyone who's working on a DEI committee, anyone who's doing DEI work, if it is not their formal job, that you ensure that you allocate at least 5% of their pay and 5% of their time as they set aside for their participation. Most organizations are moving with what we call an extractive model, meaning that they're asking for people who hold marginalized and minoritized identities to do the work of increasing value and culture for the firm at the individual's cost. You have to put that as a formal part of their job description in order to respect them. You have to compensate them for their time, even just legally. This is not a volunteer experience, and it's especially for people who are Black and brown or women or LGBTQ or otherwise, it is often a re-traumatizing experience, meaning that you're asking for emotional labor in a workplace that often many of those persons are not even equipped or knowledgeable to engage the emotional work of DEI. You're asking them to act as if this is just an intellectual experience, and it is simply not. It is super emotional. So that's one thing I'd say. On the personal side, go home, look at your own budget. Can y'all look at your budget? Can y'all stop talking about supplier diversity in the workplace? Look at your budget. How much are you actually spending of your discretionary income with Black and brown and women-owned businesses? How much are you actually doing that as a household, teaching and working with your kids to do that? Creating that. And so my challenge always is look at 30% of your discretionary. Reorganize your home. Like I said, this work starts at the individual side, then it becomes an organizational understanding. Where you intentionally segregate your home, you remove the probability for experiences that will grow your capacity and acumen to do the work in your company. Because much of the growth and expertise in this happens in community. When you only learn by reading White Fragility, that doesn't mean you know how to do anything that Bob and D'Angelo talked about. That just means that you intellectually understand it. You may be so uncomfortable doing all of that you become completely ineffective at leading something like that, even though you signed up for it because you read the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much, X. This is amazing. I would love for anybody to put in the chat here of what their biggest takeaway is, or if they do have any questions that we can capture and we can help follow up here to grab. And then anything that you've learned, please just make sure that you bring to action. I think that's a huge piece of this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I know we're right up on time. The last two things that I'm going to say is this is recorded. I know that I cheated and I just put a bunch of times that I wanted to go back to personally to be able to watch. So I'm hoping that other people did that so that they can go rewatch this recording. Our next webinar is going to be on the 17th of June. So just stay tuned to that. And then as always, we look forward to seeing everybody. Thank you, Xavier, for all of your hard work here today. And to the Cultivate community, we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks so much, Simone. Thanks, Cultivate.